Today we are going to be talking about our observable future. And this is a particularly interesting point, especially in the JavaScript world right now, especially when reactive programming is definitely a thing nowadays. So before we really get started, what I want to do is I want to dive through really some quick what I mean by observable or reactive programs. Like, for example, if you're doing game programming, well, what do you think that deals with? That deals with, once again, dealing with events and responding to events, dealing with loops and dealing with loops. Whether it's also, and by the way, I lose because I didn't care anymore, to anything from simple drawing to canvas painting, the ability to suddenly change colors. All of these things are all one thing. They're all streams. So if you start to think about every single data set that you deal with as streams, this Mario character, he's a stream. This image crop, it's a stream. Even drag and drop, or even doing real-time data analysis using on Wikipedia, is all just streams, and it's understanding stream data. So with that in mind, let's actually get started. So to fully start with a JavaScript conference, I might as well start with JavaScript. So what's up? Hope everyone has learned some stuff. Hopefully, especially at the functional reactive programming or reactive programming workshop that was held yesterday. And what start of a conference or talk is incomplete with a concurrency joke. You know, as an ode and tribute to Guns N' Roses, take me down to the concurrency city where the green pretty is the grass, the and are. Damn it, I should have used promises or something. I don't know. Anyways, few people like that tweet. So who am I? I am a developer and open sourcer. So yes, I do in fact have a hat and I do have a wand. Someone was nice enough to give me in the speaker room a wand, so it would be really kind of amazing if it just magically go like that. There you go. And so I work for this particular small company that's based in Redmond. And what I like to think is I bring a little bit of metal back to Microsoft. Reactive metal especially, so you know, something like fluorine or something like that. And since 2010, 2009, I've been working on this thing called the Reactive extensions. So we're at ReactiveX, and you can find more about us there. But this was designed at a time when things like promises weren't really a thing yet. We wanted a way to talk about data and everything else as one single thing that we can query against. And that's what led to this. So you could also say that I'm an RX pusher. So let's just get this out of the way. Async is awful. And because of that, just having to coordinate all these various things together is very, very distracting. I don't know why the guy couldn't just put down something. But anyways, this is all the single-threaded nature of JavaScript here, is the fact that all that state just causes a crash right there. And callback hell really is a thing. I would say probably in Dante's Inferno, probably level 9, as far down in hell as you can go. And it's not just because you're nesting callbacks upon callbacks, just because you're too lazy to actually create a real function. But actually, if you're creating really complex state machines inside of there, like to determine whether you should play a movie or you should exit. And guess what? It's really hard to actually retry any of that logic. And what you end up with is something like a cow's head that walks off the screen and silently walks back with hopefully some air catching under the chin. Events aren't any better. Because with events you have this composition problem as well, is the fact that you have these three disparate handlers for mouse up, mouse down, and mouse move. And then you have this sort of state that's just hanging around and waiting for something to happen. So you're basically having to order the events yourself. And then you have to not only add the event listeners, but you also have to remove the event listeners, because if you're trying to keep the page from leaking memory and so forth, you kind of need to do that. So what you end up with a lot of the times when you're trying to coordinate events is you're pretty much that. You just miss. Sorry, kid. So promises are a great thing, but they're only part of a solution. So you have now player initialized, so we took that callback hill and kind of refactored it into some code. So we can say player initialize, and then authorize the movie, or they have a login error, and then play the movie, or they're unauthorized. Seems fairly straightforward enough. But there are some problems necessarily with promises as they are standardized today. That give me some concern, but I do hope that we will address them in the JavaScript language spec. For example, cancellation is not part of a promise today. So in the fact that the fetch API as part of service workers and everything else does not have a notion of canceling an XHR through a promise. You have to use the streams interface to do so. Not ideal, obviously. But yeah, this conversation obviously has quite a few people. Gosh, how many comments was it? 204 comments and 21 participants. So you could probably say the joke is, how many developers does it take to cancel a promise? Sorry, had to. And once again, since we're dealing with asynchronous stuff, what we want to ultimately have is have some cleanup. But yet, there isn't any right now in the spec. Hopefully there will be, but right now there isn't. And what I'm offering to you is a way that we will be able to get that. So, anyways, let's talk about a problem that a lot of people have with any application that they write. How many people here have written a type-ahead search or an autocomplete? How many have done it right? Okay, almost all the hands. Oh, there's a brave person there who says that they got it all right. Congratulations, you're one of the few. What's that? Oh, well, you used RX. Well, then, there you go. So I decided just to show you basically some of the implications of this. A, you don't want to type too much to send over to the server, obviously. And you really only want to send some data over when the text actually changes. Not only that, you might want some retry logic. But the first and foremost is you always want the data that you last requested. Not the data I requested 2 keystrokes ago, but the data I requested now. And that's one of the hardest problems to deal with. So I went ahead and implemented in jQuery. Just plain old jQuery. So yeah, I have to check whether there's a outgoing XHR. I check for it's canceled, yada, yada, yada. I add my own debounce function. I'm sure there's a jQuery plugin for all of this, but I just couldn't be bothered to it. So, you know, write more, do less. Can we do better? You know, we're dealing with all of this stuff. Can we do better than what we have right now? I think so, because, you know, even past presidents of ours has made this a national priority. We chose to solve asynchronous programming and do other things. This is the 1960s, mind you. Not because they're easy, but because they are hard. And then he later changed that. You know, this is the first draft. He later changed it to going to the moon because at least that was possible. I think. Citation needed. Damn. So anyways, how do you actually solve some of these problems in a more, what I would call, reactive way? So in this particular code, what we're doing is we're calling this magic voodoo function called flatmap. And if you're familiar with promises and thenables, then it's kind of akin to the same thing. It's like this, then this, and that. So for example, here we can initialize the player. We can then take the player attempts, get the movie, try to authorize them, retry 3 times, and if we still fail, then it's going to be an error. But not only that, but it also gives me an extra bailout condition where I say, if I click that cancel button, it goes away. So finally, it gives me that option of like, oh crap, I didn't mean to do this, and now I can finally do something about it. Mouse drags, the little sample demo that I showed you there, instead of having those 3 disparate callbacks that were not chained together at all, now I can actually do that by just saying mouse down, flat mouse move, until mouse up. It's basically mouse down and mouse move until mouse up. That's it. Now that 2-page jQuery could be condensed into pretty much that. So all I'm doing is I'm taking the key input, I'm getting the current value, I'm going to say stop, wait for them to stop typing for 500 milliseconds, make sure it's distinct text, and go and make that query and make sure it's the latest one and cancel everything else. And that's it. So it's fewer ways to burn yourself, quite honestly, in much less code. So what the heck is this reactive programming thing? You know, everyone seems to come up with 5 or 6 different definitions. First off, it's not React. And thank you, React and Facebook, for further diluting that name. And it's certainly not object observed, which people go, oh, observables, that's object observed. No. Object observed was basically the way to read an object's particular changes. You know, when data binding, two-way data binding was a real hot thing. And we kind of realized it wasn't such a good thing when it came to performance. So that has since been withdrawn from the standardization committee. So what is it? So, of course, the dictionary is always a great source to go to. And readily responding to a stimulus. Well, we've already been doing that, haven't we? You know, p.click function this slide up, done. Okay, that's reactive, isn't it? Well, I'll say for us old folks, we've been doing reactive programming much longer than that in Excel. And the fact that I can do any computation, and then it automatically reacts without me having to refresh anything. But if you really want to read the paper that started it all, go here. I'm not going to force you to, because I know when most people read academic papers, this is what happens. Sorry. So I won't, you know, even the best of us have really bad reactions to that. And even the very industrious Germans have a good word for it, if you can actually say that. There you go. But it's a little bit more than that, isn't it? Because it's also react to load. Like, for example, when I talked about debounce and I talked about distinct until changed, I'm dealing with reacting to load. I'm basically cutting down the load that I'm facing so that I'm not having to shove observables down my shirts to get rid of them. And also, it's how you react to failure. You know, if you catch on fire, how do you actually put it out? And most of all, reacting to users. You know, when you handle errors, when you handle all these sorts of things, how are you actually treating the user? That's actually very important. So let's take a trip back to 1994, which I'm sure half of you weren't born in, but let's do it anyways, to a book called The Gang of Four book. And in there, they had many design patterns in there, and they connected all of them that really mattered. But what I really was interested in was the iterator and the observer pattern. But there was no direct link between them, and I wondered why. So I'll ask you a question then. What is the difference between an iterable object, such as an array, and an event? I say absolutely nothing, in the fact that they are both collections and you should be able to both combine and compose over them. And we have this with ES 2015. We have the iterator where we can call next, 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 and get values. But we have also had in the DOM since forever the ability to have that subject-observer pattern, which is nothing more than add event listener. That's it. So when you move that mouse, you get values. So I would certainly say that the observable is really kind of the subject-observer done right. And the reason why I say that is because now with observable, we have a single subscribe method. And that subscribe, basically, we hand an observer, so anytime we get data, tell me about it on these particular methods here, on next, on error, and on complete. But not only that, but I'm going to hand you a subscription, and that subscription tells me exactly how to tear down once I'm done. So for example, when I'm adding event listener, in the teardown, I remove the event listener. So that allows us to compose together these very rich queries, and at the very end, it cleans up everything, and there are no leaks. And there's a very strict grammar to that as well. So for example, we could have a couple of values, infinite values, a couple of values and an error, and a couple of values in completion. But what we cannot do is we cannot have overlapping, and we cannot have things that happen after you've stopped wanting them. Now, what we really have because of this observable is we now have this first-class object. Instead of having these handlers and these callbacks that we've had before, dealing with events, we now have this object. I can pass you mouse movements. I can pass you an AJAX request. I can pass you a stock ticker, whatever you want to call it. And so where does it fit? Well, in the world of synchronous and asynchronous and multiple value and single value, we have object, obviously, for synchronous, and iterable for multiple values, and for promise for async single value. And then what we have is we have observable. But if you look at the iterable and observable, the code's exactly alike. So if you know one, you pretty much know the other. So you come to that sort of Zen-like realization that everything's a stream. And most of the stuff that you're going to do can be written in very few functions. So for example, map, transforming one to another. So in this case, transforming every circle to a diamond. Filter, I only want circles. Or even the more interesting flat map, which I talked about earlier. It's more of the idea that you're returning a collection, and then you're flattening it based upon the time that it actually responded. So as you can see here, there's still a little bit of interleaving between the blue and the green there. Well, it's just because that's the time that it actually reacted. That's really, that's the only thing that you really need to remember about that. But now that we remember this, will anyone go back to for loops? No. Or at least you shouldn't. So the future really is here. And it's been here for quite a while. But it only came up very recently, for example, when Angular decided that they were going to build in observables directly into Angular 2 going forward. So any of the things that you had talked about, like HTTP, there is events for value changes, and we'll actually go through some of that. So let's go back to our handy-dandy little type-ahead search. Okay, so we're going to implement that using Angular 2. So what we're going to show you is we now have this ng form control of term, and we're also going to use this async pipe, and I'll show you why that's interesting in just a second. But here we can create our Wikipedia service, and we can have our search, which is nothing more than saying JSON-P, which is given to us. JSON-P, once again, the get is an observable. Unlike in Angular 1, which was a promise, it's now an observable. Why? Richer composition. And now what we can do is we can do our same autocomplete the very same way. So if you notice up here, the items that I was going to on the UI, well, that's just an observable string. Now we have this control here, and now we can take this control and we can listen to the value changes, so it'll give us a string every time it changes. We're going to do the distinct check, and then we're going to do the switch map. But if you notice here, I don't have a subscribe anywhere for this. That's because the async pipe handles that automatically for us. So we don't have to do anything. And that's kind of cool. Now, some people are looking, well, I'd like to do Redux or something like that on top of Angular. Well, Rob Wormwald who's now just recently joined the Angular team at Google, has some really cool stuff. So, for example, if you like Redux, there's a complete Redux written in RxJS. Now let's go back to that thing called React. What can we do here? What's really kind of interesting is the fact that it has this very same life cycle that we're very much used to. This component did mount, this component will unmount. And the idea there is that it has its state of creation, and it has its state of tearing down. And that's exactly what observables have as well. So what about Flux? Well, there are many implementations, and gosh knows I have in the speaker notes that I put on GitHub. There are many implementations of Flux out there. Just do a search on GitHub. Chances are you're going to find 15,000 of them. But anyways, this one is fairly interesting, and not just because it has a really cute GIF, although it does, you know. So what's really interesting about this is it has all of the things that you would expect for Redux. But not only that, but it has this idea of an agenda. So this idea of agenda is basically you can compose this entire chain together, and if any part of that fails, then the entire thing rolls back. So you have that forward and roll back kind of things. So let's actually take a look at the Redux documentation for a little bit. Now, I think it's kind of cool that it's actually brought out here. The question is, do you need Redux if you're already using Rx? It's not hard to re-implement Redux in Rx, after all. It's just scan. And I'm going to show you exactly that here in just a second. But there's another framework out there called Cycle by Andre Staltz, which is very, very interesting. It's a take on architecture where they are looking at going from a model view intent where you have the DOM basically injected into you, and then you're creating your model as you go along, your increments, decrements, and guess what? You're going to merge them together, and then you're going to say scan. There's your Redux. And then all you have to do is just model out your div, and you're done. So that's the simple canonical increment, decrement, all using just observables right there. Start with 0, scan, and combine. There are other ones such as yoke, which is a fascinating one as well. But there is also, what about the server? Is Rx and observables good for the server? After all, if you look at Node itself, you'll notice most of the things that it does is very event-driven or callback-driven. Well, duh, that's exactly what observables are all about. So for example, if you start with the very, very basics of taking an HTTP server and for everyone sending it through a pipeline, now you can start doing a lot more interesting things, such as rate limiting, such as retries and so forth that happen along the chain. That's very, very interesting because you not only have the power of the events and so forth, but you have the full power of observables at your back. So let's look really into the future right now. Okay? We are on track, meaning we, as in the JavaScript community, may have observables coming to them directly in the browser, just as we have promises. So you could imagine this primitive that we could build upon that everyone could take advantage of, no matter what framework that you happen to be using, whether it's Ember, Angular, React, etc. You just have the basic primitive that you can deal with. And so right now it's currently in stage 1, which means it's still fairly rough in terms of getting there. But the idea is to finally have events in the JavaScript language itself. The DOM has it with add event listener and remove event listener. Node has it with event emitter, but the JavaScript language itself does not. So if we could think about this, because it would save us a lot of, for example, I know in my Node work, they'll say, oh, you've reached too many listeners on event emitter, you've got a problem, so you've got a leak. Well, with observables, hopefully you won't have that problem. So what exactly would it look like then? Well, observables really would look no different than what they are today. We would just be able to build upon them using the basic building blocks that we've already done. So just to kind of recap just a little bit here, we're going from this thing that started as a small project back in 2009, 2010 timeframe to something that's a lot greater than that. Something that could be a standard that everyone can get behind and start to use, and to start to make richer and richer applications. So with that, I want you all to go and make Reactive great again. Sorry, I don't have the red hats, but I'll deal with this thing instead. But yeah, that's the most important takeaway point. Is now that we've got this RX, which I started way back when, but now it is in RxJS v5, which is a complete rewrite of Rx, in such a way that it's written in TypeScript, so it's better type safety. But not only that, it also has some very nice developer features, a little bit better performance, etc. So it's really, really exciting to be in the observable world right now. There is just so much going on. If you just do a search for observables or anything like that on, or FRP or anything, or reactive programming on Twitter, you will just be utterly amazed by what people are doing out there. And I might be biased because I wrote Rx and there are other libraries out there for certain, but I think it's very exciting right now. So with that, 3 minutes, questions? Stunning silence, I love it. Everyone's just eager to get the heck out of here. Beautiful. It is the last session of the day, so I'm stopping you from doing what have you. Stunned silence, I love this. Well, with that, thank you very much.